Good morning, everyone. As Genevieve mentioned, my name is Ellie Barmacel, and it's such a joy to be here with you and these two amazing women to my left. Without further ado, I'd really love to kick it over to Josina Morita, who is the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District Commissioner. She's a history maker. She was the first Asian American woman to win county-wide office in Illinois. And Lauren Underwood, who is running for Congress in Illinois' 14th district. She's our Democratic nominee and kicking ass and taking names on the campaign trail. Ladies, it's such an honor to share this stage with you. I'd love to hear from you about how your experience on the campaign trail has been. What challenges have you encountered out there that you feel are unique to being a woman out on the trail and unique to being women of color out there knocking doors and taking names?
All right, that's a big question. So thanks again for having me. I'm Josina Morita, newly elected commissioner at the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District. I ran in thank you. I'm unique and also not unique in that I ran in 2014 and lost by 2%, and then ran again in 2016 and won. And so I think that I have experiences in both contexts. And I think, for me, I ran as the first Asian American endorsed by the Cook County Democratic Party and the first Asian American to be running county-wide for an office like this. And so, we live here in Chicago, most of us, and we have certain experiences with diversity. Campaigning county-wide, I was the first Asian American a lot of people were meeting. Definitely on the campaign trail, but some people ever. And so there's a lot of perceptions, misperceptions, lack of perceptions about what it meant to be an Asian American. Some were good and curious, asking questions. Some were not so good. I have to say, as somebody who worked in nonprofit before I ran for office and lived in Chicago, I had not really been ching-chonged before, that kind of stuff. And I would say as a woman of color, the racism and the sexism were very much intertwined. Right? The people who say sexist things tend to not be so good on race either. And so it was never, I think some people have seen my abrupt quotes from Carrie Lester's book. It was never just sexual. It would be, I've never tasted Chinese pea before. Or instead of just being a bee, you're a chink bee. It was always very intertwined. And so it was difficult, and this was not just coming from constituents, it was coming from other elected officials, people in the party. And so, I think the piece of advice that I give to women and people of color, and definitely women of color who are running, is, one, know that this is a possibility. I hope it doesn't happen to you, but it may. And I think the number one thing is to be prepared. I think the hard thing for me is these things would happen in a room of 1,000 people, and by the time you come to, they're gone. It's past. It was almost like nothing to them. And so it's, what do you want to say? What do you want to do? Who are you going to call when these things do happen? Hopefully they don't. But it's part of running. I always say I've never experienced more blatant racism and sexism than I did on the campaign trail. And I think part of it is going to geographies where I was new, but I think there's also sometimes a perception that if somebody's asking for your vote, you can treat them a certain way, in a way that maybe you're not used to being treated in the workplace, or even in elected office, so.
Thank you for that.
Hi, I'm Lauren Underwood, running for Congress in the Illinois 14th District. We're about 45 minutes west of Chicago. Thank you. Go up to the Wisconsin border. It's 7 counties in the western suburbs, half suburban, half rural. Just won the Democratic nomination, beat 6 guys with 57% of the vote. And so when I launched the campaign, I'll be really honest with you, I thought that it was going to be an avalanche of racism. I was sort of steeled against it. I grew up in Naperville, a town that's not necessarily known to have a large African American community, but I learned how to be a strong black woman in this district. And so I thought that I would be able to navigate that space. What I was not prepared for was the sexism. I'm a nurse, spent my career in healthcare, and so in every job that I've had, the whole vertical has been women. And so women at the highest levels of the organizations that I worked in. And so I had never been underestimated because I was a woman. I had never been threatened in the workplace because I was a woman, like physically threatened. And so those things have been new to me on the campaign trail. What I will say with respect to being a woman of color is that I think that the press has been something that I have struggled with because it's a news story, it's interesting, and everybody wants to cover the black woman winning and dominating in this white community, right? But in my community, I don't talk about race. I can't be the black woman, right? I have to be Oprah. Does that make sense? And so for anybody who's here, who's pitching and whatever, I think that while it may be newsy, it doesn't help us win elections. And we're here to win elections. Now, I understand that's not the press's goal, but I do think that the narrative that gets developed around candidacies like mine, I don't know about like yours, being a historic first is exciting, but people aren't voting to make history necessarily. Everyone's not. Folks in my community are voting for a better representative, and the history-making narrative only is not always helpful in my community.
Thank you both for sharing your experiences. I know that being on the campaign trail can be very lonely despite having a staff. So I often wonder, what are the critical resources that have been helpful to you in staying the course and feeling like you can stick with this and see it through to the end and hopefully win? I mean, I know that we share things like the I Will program in common, but what are, in addition to I Will, what are some of the resources that have been essential for you?
So I think that there are a lot of organizations in place that help provide the tools and training. One of the things that I didn't anticipate was that there was going to be such a cohort of young millennials, women, and people of color running for Congress specifically this cycle, and it has been a joy to get to know so many of them. And in that camaraderie, there's a lot of strength that I draw from being able to text a new friend who's running in Texas or in Michigan or in California and say, girl, this has been a day, or something like that. And to really be able to just have that conversation, because this is such an odd experience. That's the best word I have for it. And so I appreciate that friendship that gets formed among candidates.
Yeah, I think it's on a lot of different layers. I think, one thing that I think is really important when you run for office is knowing who you are and having those people who know who you are, know who you were before you ran, and are going to be the ones that are going to hold you accountable afterwards. And so having that, they don't have to be political, they don't have to be campaign experts, but just the core of people who know who you are. For me, also, a set of new people, they always say there are going to be people who are going to disappoint you, who you think are going to come through for you, who are going to disappoint you. There will also be people that you don't even know yet who are going to come through for you in ways that you never expected. And those people became, I think, right, that core of new friends who are going through this shared experience with you. I needed mentors, right? And the traditional path in Cook County politics is you find your kind of racial sponsor or your community sponsor, and being the first, you don't have that. Right? So there was no Asian American in the Democratic Party. There was no Asian American in politics that I could really go to help navigate the process for me. And so it was a lot of women like Deb Shore, a lot of my other mentors, who adopted me and who cared about the things that I cared about for different reasons, that I had to find ways to connect with people beyond my race, sometimes beyond my gender, even beyond the issues of Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, to kind of build that team. But it takes a lot.
Can I add one other thing based on that? There's a domino effect that happens. When women step forward to run, oftentimes we show others that it's possible to follow behind us. I've seen that happen just this cycle with women stepping forward to run for state and local office in our community, one where we had not had Democratic women specifically running. And so I think that sharing these experiences in real time with those, even not running for the same office, but just creating that kind of a cohort and that kind of community helps all of us be successful. Because there's no reason for us to be making the same mistakes. And so I'm not even speaking about anything as formal as, path blazing, but just having that kind of an open dialogue with folks that might be struggling with some of the same concerns. It's one that's been important to me and I found helpful too.
And I think we're living in unique times, right, where we have more women and women of color in leadership. Without Toni Preckwinkle being in leadership of the Democratic Party, I don't think I would have had a path, right? And so even though we're not Asian American together, I think having that experience of having to navigate the party as an outsider, being women, being people of color, having people in those positions who are now able to help pull people along, I feel very fortunate to be running in a time like this.
I think it's interesting. Both of you have talked a bit about what it's like trying to find the right, sponsor or mentor to help navigate the process. And while we are fortunate to be seeing a record number of women and people of color running, it's still a drop in the bucket compared to what we'd like to see ultimately. From your experiences, what do you think we could be doing more effectively to help recruit, train, and resource women and people of color to really thrive in the political ecosystem? Like, how are we missing the mark right now, and what could we do better?
So one of the things, running for Congress, I think, is a little bit of a different beast. But what I found is that both the goalposts are always changing, and they're not consistently applied for even candidates in the same race. And so if there's a certain amount of money we need to raise to be deemed as viable, right, that should be applied across the board. I, as a black woman, shouldn't have a higher sum than my white male colleague, right? And so that viability piece is one that doesn't ever get discussed in public. It's discussed one-on-one with someone in power saying, well, dear, I don't think that you're gonna make it, right? And I think that if we are going to be serious as Democrats, if we are gonna be serious as emerging leaders in this space, whatever role you play, I think that we need to have an upfront and honest conversation about viability, what it means to you, and how we are going to apply that metric test, or that litmus test. Because what I see happening, particularly among candidates of color, is that viability is being assessed differently, both district by district, and for candidates with different backgrounds, and it's not an upfront conversation. And so because we're not able to discuss it in public, then folks have no chance because they don't even know what they're being measured against. And so I'm speaking kind of obliquely, but I am the only African-American woman on Red to Blue, which is the DCCC's program of top-tier candidates running nationwide. There are probably at least 20 African-American women who have declared, okay? And I would bet money that they have not had the same candid conversations with those who make decisions about viability as I've had. And I think that that's a shame. And if we, in fact, want to see a more representative government, I believe we need to have at least an honest conversation about the metrics upon which people are going to be judged. Thank you.
No, I totally agree with that. I was going to say we need to change the equation, right? I think there's a lot of assumptions that we make about who's viable and who's not viable. I think we make a lot of presumptions that non-black people will not vote for a black candidate. Same with Asian Americans. People said, oh, well, if Asian Americans are only 4% of Cook County, how are you going to win? Right? And I think so there's a lot of assumptions. I think we just saw with Stacey Abrams. It's also, we have an assumption about who the electorate is. As well as who we think that they're going to vote for. And so there's a difference between a campaign where you have a candidate who can energize the base to turn out versus dealing with the electorate as it normally is, particularly in off-year cycles. And so I think there's a lot to be said about changing that equation. I also think that, for me in the Asian American community, we for the first time, 10 years ago when I moved here, there were no Asian Americans in major elected offices. We now, for the first time, have Asian Americans at every level of government, from federal, county, state, city. We just tripled the Asian American caucus in the General Assembly in March, well, hopefully November. And I think we're at a place right now where the first reaction was, okay, well, now we need more Asian Americans to run. But I think there's a whole nother layer that's really important around infrastructure and capacity building within the community. It's not just about people running, it's about people learning how to be campaign managers, learning how to be fundraisers, learning how to do field, learning how to manage volunteers, learning how to do social media. If we're gonna move forward as even just talking about the Asian American community, we have to think about that infrastructure. And the draw shouldn't always be to have to be the one. The draw shouldn't always have to be the candidate or the elected official. How are we building the infrastructure for the community to have the voices heard and represented in the way that's to me, that's the end goal. It's not for me to be in office, but to make sure that Asian American communities and other communities have the representation that they deserve.
And if we're going to be playing this identity politics game, I believe that if we are, which probably is not the best way to do this, then we need to have a whole identity politics infrastructure, which we don't have, at least I think in communities of color. Because in the black community, we don't have a black donor base. We don't have a black staff base. We don't have a black, gatekeeper base. when we're talking about 435 seats, right? It might be in the city of Chicago, right? But out where I live, we don't have that, right? And so if a candidate wants to emerge and put their name on a ballot and represent their community, if we're gonna play an identity politics game, where are they gonna go? Right? Because then you're literally the trailblazer for every level, staff, money, right, organization, and it doesn't work, right? And so if we're gonna have a more representative government, then either I think we need to get rid of this identity politics game as a measure in viability, or we need to do the work in creating that whole infrastructure and ecosystem to support diverse candidates.
And it's a whole nother layer once you get into office too, right? Is once you're the only Asian American, then all Asian Americans think that you work for them and only them. And there's an expectation that you're going to support every Asian American candidate that's going to run. And for me, as somebody who cares about the Asian American community, just because you're Asian doesn't mean I'm going to support you. You have to have shown that you've done work, that you have commitment, that you're a viable candidate, that you will get stuff done not just for the Asian American community, that you'll be a bridge builder with other communities of color, that you care about the issues that I care about. And that's a really difficult conversation to have post-election.
Well, it's interesting as our country becomes increasingly more diverse and there are more people like me who have a very diverse background. If I only voted for Filipino Jewish candidates, I would stay home every election day.
You wouldn't have voted yet.
Yeah, no, I'd still be sitting at home waiting for my turn to go vote. I recognize that our time here, unfortunately, is drawing to a close, but we've got a room full of incredible people here in front of us, many of whom I imagine care a lot about what both of you have shared today. If you were going to implore the people in this room who are working on a wide array of projects that can influence the topic that we discussed here today, what's one ask you would make of our fellow NewFounders friends today?
We have an opportunity to elect a Congress that looks like America. We have the candidates running who are skilled and who are qualified that reflect the diversity and experiences of America. They will only win if folks in this room champion them in the broadest sense of the word. And it's not just financial, but that means that you can be a validator. That means that you can acknowledge that they're a candidate on the ballot and that whoever the favorite is might be the favorite and they might win, but this other person has a good shot and might be good too, right? And so the idea that we're gonna stay out of contested primaries inherently disadvantages, I think, candidates of color. And I think that we have a real opportunity in 2018. The cycle's not done yet. And so if that means readjusting priorities so that we have better representation in our slates, let's do it. Because we have a real shot and we have 5 months to go. And so we're gonna be working hard in 2018. I know you will too, but let's make sure that we have the most diverse, competent, qualified class we can. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, a lot of us are here because we're having conversations about what it means to be building a different kind of movement, a different kind of strategy, and partly a different kind of equation of what's viable. Part of that, I think, is redefining these things and making sure that those conversations are happening in your organizations and in your spaces, that we're not just necessarily taking the old Democratic playbook and making these different assumptions about viability and identity politics and really being those people, that voice at the table for women of color in particular, and bringing us into these spaces. It's one of those things, like, I get called, like, this is my busy month because this is Asian American Heritage Month. I get called for everything. There's more than just one of us, and part of my job is to bring others along in the process and get them at different tables. There's a saying that you're either, at the table or you're on the menu, and my job is to bring more people to the table. And so, every table that you're at, think about who's missing. What conversation is not being had? What assumptions are we working under? And think about, who else can we be bringing to the table to have a different kind of conversation and a different kind of movement?
Absolutely. I mean, I'd argue we're going to be a buffet, not just on the menu. We'll be a buffet if we don't all step up and make sure that we create a more diverse, representative body. So thank you both, Josina and Lauren, for your leadership.
Thank you, Ellie.
And thank you all for joining us.